start today. Gemma will speak about more practical aspects of deep learning. And then Wednesday will be the last class, and I'll speak about more about theory and theorems on deep learning, especially about hierarchy. Gemma.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm a postdoc at Tommy Poggio's lab. My name is Gemma, as he said. And today we are going to talk about deep neural networks. So DNN stands for deep neural networks. How do they work and where we can use them, in which problems they have achieved very good results. Oops. Okay, so this is the overview of the class. So first I'm going to give a brief introduction in which task mainly I'm going to focus my explanation. And then I'm going to briefly talk about artificial neural networks in general. So I'm going to focus most of the talk on object recognition. But first the introduction will be more general. So artificial neural networks in general. Then some computational models for object recognition, more particular, so where do they come from also. And then after that, more to the artificial neural networks. So how can we use them in practice, which algorithms do we have, and where we can apply them with the computers. And then more broadly, some applications and open questions. Okay. So the task that I'm going to mainly focus today is object recognition. So what is object recognition? So given an image, you have to answer what object is inside the image. So you have to give a label. For instance, in the one at the top, you show it and there is a bike, and you deliver a label like bike, for instance, and the other one train, and the one in the bottom, bird, for instance. So for a human, this is a very easy task to do. But we want algorithms that are able to do the same task and with a good performance. So just as a reminder, so how can we achieve this? So the algorithms need to learn from examples, in this case images, and these images are shown to the algorithm, and this is the training phase. And then at testing time, you give an image that the algorithm has never seen before, and the algorithm should deliver a label. Okay? And there are different modalities for learning. So for instance, I think you have seen most of them during the course, with fully supervised, which means that at training phase you have all examples with their corresponding label. Unsupervised, in which at training phase you don't have the labels at all, but only the examples. Or semi-supervised, which is a combination of both. So you have images, examples with labels, and some other images that are not labeled, but you still want to leverage that you have more information to learn a better model. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the artificial neural network. So here is the principle. You already seen this in the last class with simplified neuroscience. So a neuron, very simplified, what it does is a dot product between the input and the synaptic weight. So here you see the input, the X, and the synaptic weights in these cases are the T. And then afterwards, you have the response of the neuron, which is the dot product. So how much, for instance, the input resembles the synaptic weights with this similarity measure. So a way to model this is the perceptron, in which here you can have, which is the one-layer neural network, in which you have the input, in this case is P, and then the synaptic weights, and N is the result of the dot product. B is only a bias term. And after this, we have a nonlinearity, which can be different things. Like, for instance, the sign function, in which if it's negative, you set it to 0, and if it's positive, you set it to 1. Another example of nonlinearity can be a semi-linear, in which you have a range that is linear, but then at the extremes you have this setting to 0 or setting to 1, saturating, or a sigmoid, for instance. So in neuroscience, the most popular one that people use is the sigmoid function, but then later we will see that now for the DNNs, what people is using now is the rectified linear units that I'm going to talk about later, so don't worry about that. So how can we learn these weights? So a way to learn it is with gradient descent, okay? And it has been shown that if the data, which are the points x, so the vectors x, are linearly separable, this gradient descent converges in a bounded amount of iterations. But if the data is not linearly separable, then this learning algorithm with a gradient descent doesn't converge. Okay? Just a bit of reminder. So here what it was proposed is a multi-layer perceptron. So instead of having only one unit or one layer neural network, you can have a multi-layer perceptron in which you have many hidden layers stacked one after the other. And this can be proved that is a universal approximator of any function. So we don't have the problem of not being able to learn from the data. But since we have many layers, so how can we learn the parameters from the hidden layers? Because when we only have one hidden layer, it's very easy to derive, right? But here, so how is it done is with back-propagation. So Lorenzo already explained you how this can be done, which is with the chain rule. So the output of one layer, you derive with respect to this to get the derivative of this particular layer, and then you do it with the chain rule. And this is an iterative process of 2 steps. One step is the propagation. So you just forward pass your input through the neural network, and then you backward pass using this derivative with the chain rule. And then you do weights update. If you do this process online, then you have the stochastic gradient descent, okay? So what I just explained you was a general case of the artificial neural networks, but these can be used to model, computationally model, what the brain is doing for object recognition. So just a very brief introduction. So here we have the brain of the macaque, and the ventral stream is in color. So we have B1, B2, B4, and IT. Okay, in B1, we have neurons that are very selective for very simple stimuli. For instance, oriented lines, as you see in the slide. And then when you go progressively over this hierarchy, let's say like B2, B4, and IT, the stimuli from which the neurons are selective become much more complex, as you can see in the bottom. For instance, when you reach IT, the receptive fields are much larger, and then the stimuli can be as complex as part of objects, or for instance, faces or any other object. Okay? So this is just to give you an idea that this hierarchy goes from very simple stimuli, and then it's stacked, and at the end it is able to recognize, or it's selective for a stimuli that can be very complex. So all this started more or less when Hubel and Wiesel discovered that in the V1 of the cat, the neurons were selective to moving bars. They got the Nobel Prize for this. And I just wanted to show you a video of when they discovered that, so you can see the setup of the experiment. So let me see if you can hear.
The researchers actually listened in to individual nerve cells firing in the anesthetized cat. as they presented it with different visual images.
So here you can see the
When
cat.
we started working, Torsten and I, in the late 50s, we set up our first experiments, and they didn't go well because at the beginning we couldn't make the cells fire at all. We'd shine lights all over the screen, and nothing seemed to work. And rather by accident, one day, we were shining small spots, either white spots or black spots, onto the screen, and we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina.
Let me see if you, okay.
Every time we did that, we'd get a response.
So here what is interesting is that, whoops, I don't want to. What is interesting is that at the beginning they were showing black dots to the cat and the neurons weren't responding. But then when they slide down this glass paper, there was an edge, and this edge made the neurons fire. So that's why how they discovered that the neurons were firing when there was an oriented light line presented to them, to the cat. And here just another video that will show you related to pooling that you had the other class. So these lines that are presented make the complex cell fire in a region of the space. So not only in a very particular region, but in this case, in this square region. So this means that this neuron is invariant to all these regions. So no matter where the line is presented, that the neuron will fire. Okay. So let me show you this very quickly, just a few seconds. Oops. Let me see. Okay, maybe here. Here you can see that so this particular neuron is activated when there is a vertical line presented, okay, and it's firing no matter where in this square is presented. But if the line is outside the square, then it's not firing anymore. Okay. So here you can see the combination of the simple cells, which is one neuron that fires for, in this case, a vertical line, and the complex cells, which takes into account all this region, and it's invariant to this position. Okay, this is just a brief introduction to this. So here is the model for what you just saw. Okay, so the simple cells are active, let's say, when there are vertical lines presented to them in the receptive field, and then the complex cells make all the response invariant to the position of the vertical line. Okay, in this case, all this circle. So no matter where the line is presented, that the complex cell will be activated. Is it clear? More or less. Okay, so here it's just to emphasize that the simple cell is like a template matching. So you can imagine you have a template store, and then when a stimuli similar to this template is presented in this receptive field is activated, so it's for selectivity. And the complex cell is for invariance. So no matter where you present the stimuli, the neuron will be activated. Okay. So for instance, you can think about the simple cell as a tuning function, like a delta in the stream case, which is when the input stimuli is equal to the template, it's activated, or you can have like a smooth Gaussian, so if it's similar, okay? And the complex cell can be, for instance, like a max function. No matter where it's presented, that I will activate, the neuron will be activated, or will respond. So what I just presented before was only for V1, but if you think about it, you can create a hierarchical model, in this case Hmax, which was proposed for a computational model for object recognition, in which you start with very simple templates, in this case like that are selective to lines, like for instance Gabor functions, and then over the hierarchy, the units, the neurons, are selective to much more complex patterns. Like for instance, at the end in this example, are selective to faces of this dog. And here again, we have this pattern of simple cell and complex cell. And in the complex cell, it gives us this invariance for instance, position. Okay? And this you can aggregate over the hierarchy. This is just an example that shows that at the first layer, so the red ones are the ones that are more active. So at the first layer, you have like patterns that are activated in the neurons that are very simple, like Gabor functions. And then when you go up in the hierarchy, you can have much more complex patterns like these ones here, the spirals, and so on. And the concept of invariance, so imagine you have a letter, A in this case, and you are looking for this horizontal line. So no matter where it is, this horizontal line, that you should be able to recognize it, because if I show you this letter A and then I move it, I shift it to another position, you are still able to recognize it, right? So a way to do it is with this complex cell. So you are invariant to the position. So no matter where it is, that you are still able to recognize it and to detect it. And why is this important? So just a bit of recap of what Tommy said the last class. So if you have a representation that is invariant, then your sample complexity reduces, which means that you need less examples and training to be able to achieve the same performance. Okay, because if we would have a model that is not invariant to these positions, in the case of the A, what would happen is that we should give to the algorithm, or as examples, all possible shifts of the letter to be able to recognize it. Okay, which in practice, maybe for some letters is doable, but this should be for all kind of letters and objects, which it's too much examples, right? Okay, so now that I have given you an overview of the computational models for object recognition, so I'm going to introduce you like the deep neural networks that we use in computers. So the artificial neural networks, and specifically for object recognition. Okay. So here, one of the main key ingredients that was introduced was the concept of convolution. And this concept of convolution for images is important because it gives us invariance to the location. So no matter where the object is placed in the image, that we are still able to recognize it. Okay? And this convolution at the end, what it is that the same filter or template, it's computed in all positions of the image. So then after, if we have a complex cell, like a pooling operation, we are able to detect if some of, in these positions, this particular template has a has had a high response. Okay. So this was one of the important assumptions. And this again is related to the fact that if we don't have this kind of assumption, then the model is not invariant to this translation. At learning phase, we should give to the model examples with all possible shift of all the objects, because otherwise it would not be able to generalize. Okay. And here the learning again, so this can be learned with backpropagation from the beginning up to the end. So, and at the end we need a loss function. So what are we minimizing? For instance, in the case of object recognition, it's the classification task. So we need to compute if the predicted label is the same as the original label. This at training phase, because it's the learning with a backpropagation, okay? And then this error is back projected with the backpropagation algorithm and computed with the derivative chain rule, okay? And once we have done that, we can update the weights and then do a forward with another example. For instance, in the online version. So this is the stochastic gradient descent. And this is how these models are trained and learned nowadays. Okay, you give a bunch of examples, and with stochastic gradient descent, you learn the parameters. Okay, so there were other methods before that what they were doing were separating what was the feature extraction and the classification. So here in red, you would see the feature extraction mechanism, and in blue, the classification. Okay, so the classification could be done like with an SVM, a supervector machine, for instance. And the feature extraction could be done with sparse coding, which you have seen in other classes. But then this is not joined and it's not supervised. So this is very important because it's a kind of, before was done with a two-step process, and now you can do everything at the same time with the backpropagation. So one of the first great achievements of deep convolutional neural networks was in 2012. And they showed that they achieved very good performance, and indeed much better than previous methods that were working with feature learning and then as a second step with classification. Okay, and so why was that possible? So here you can see actually the deep neural network that worked for image classification at 2012 that achieved like state-of-the-art results very far, like much better than previous methods. So the key ingredients were that the backpropagation was learned using GPUs. So you can imagine that you have, if you have a network with many layers, and in each layer you have many convolutions, so this is very computational expensive. So before, there weren't enough computational resources to be able to learn something meaningful, because that would take too much time. Okay, so what they did was use a bunch of GPUs to be able to learn a model. Okay, then another key point was using various techniques to avoid overfitting. So you can imagine that if you have, for instance, very small amount of data and a lot of parameters, then these parameters that are learned with backpropagation will be overfitted to your training data and won't be able to generalize to your task at testing time. Okay, so they will work very well at training, but then at testing, they won't be able to do any kind of prediction. And another point was that at that time, there was a data set that was released that had 1 million labeled images available. And before, the data sets were much smaller, like of the order of 10,000 or so. And this was too little amount of data to be able to train such a model with so many parameters. Okay? And since then, everyone is using deep neural networks for all tasks, which I will discuss later. So the network that I showed you before is the first one that you see, that has 7 layers. And then after that, there were many other networks that were proposed for the task of object recognition. So given an image, predict the label class of the object that is present in the image. So the most recent one is from Google, and it's very deep. It has many more layers than the first one that was proposed. Okay, and it achieves better performance. So it seems that the deeper you go, the better you can get in terms of accuracy performance. So yes, please.
So for this really deep networks, it seems like there's a lot of degrees of freedom in like the architecture, like topology of the network. Like, how do people actually decide that you're going to have like 20 layers that are going to have these sizes, and you're going to put pooling convolutional layers together?
So this is an engineering task and a design task. So it's a matter of trial and error, and that is why now deep neural networks are very successful, because the amount of resources that we can have in terms of computational power are much greater than before. So we can try many models in parallel and see which one works and which one don't work.
But there's no like theory yet to guide how you would construct the architecture.
No. So you can be guided by the design of other networks, right?
What was the number of parameter difference between the Google and BGG number of parameters?
Let me remember. So I think BGG had the deepest model that they presented had 19 layers, and each layer had, let me see. Now I don't recall the number, but the one from Google is much deeper, and also at the same layer they have 2 different kind of receptive fields templates. So they also have many more number of units at the same layer.
So at the top, was it fully connected?
At the top, they always have a fully connected. Usually, what people use is 2 layers of fully connected that are high dimensional, like the order of 4,000, and then another one, which is the final one, that has the same number of units as your number of labels. For instance, in the case of ImageNet, is 1,000. But if we would go like to a simpler data set, then probably the number of units of the last fully connected would be lower. Like there is a data set that only has 10 classes, so this would be only 10.
So the final 2 layers of BGG and Google Net are pretty much the same?
Yes, and in the first one as well.
And the first one?
Yes, in the AlexNet.
The last 2?
Yes. Okay, so one of the main problems we can have while training a network, like with this many parameters and this many number of layers, is overfitting, which means that the parameters that we learn are very adapted to your training examples and are not able to generalize and make good predictions at testing time. So one way to do it is, for instance, use the architecture of the network as a prior. One way is using a convolutional neural network, for instance. This is a prior because it doesn't seem very, like, for instance, going to neuroscience, very biologically plausible that all the units at all locations have the same filters. But here we are using this assumption, okay? So no matter where the pattern is located in the image, that I will find it because I have the same templates that are located in all the different positions of the image, okay? So another assumption that we have is the linear rectifier. So what the linear rectifier does is just activate the unit or leave it active when it has a high response. And when it has a very low response, just inhibit it and put it to 0. Okay, this is a nonlinearity that is used. Another way to avoid overfitting would be by using much more data. For instance, if we have a predetermined data set, we could just augment this data set. How we can do it? Rotating the images, shifting the images, using different scales, so any affine transformation that you can think of, even flipping the images. So this virtually augments your number of examples. Okay? And another technique that is used is the dropout. And I'm going to explain you a little bit more detail that dropout for training.
Pooling doesn't help in the overfitting.
Can you say?
Pooling, back. Pooling.
Well, the pooling is for the invariance assumption, right?
Convolution is also invariance.
As well. So, but the pooling, what it gives is that so the convolution, it's the invariance in the sense that I use the same template in all locations of the image. But without the pooling, I don't know where it is, this object, right? So the fact is that the pooling, it says no matter where it is, that this unit will be activated. Without the pooling, then I would need this augmented training set with the objects at all positions, because the neurons would fire at different locations, and then the feature would be different.
With the pooling, you would have less number of parameters, right?
Well,
because
then
you've subsampled it, right? So you're reducing the number of parameters, so you're sort of combating overfitting in the indirect sort of sense.
yes, so it's not the number of parameters, but it's more related to the data augmentation, because so introducing this invariance, what happens is that if I have an image with an object center, and then I have like a signature of my feature, and then I shift this object. If my model is invariant to this shift due to the pooling, then what would happen is that my feature vector would be exactly the same as the other one. So I don't need these two examples in my training phase because my model is already robust to that. So it's invariant to this transformation. Make sense? Okay. So one of the points that I mentioned was the rectified linear unit. So it's a nonlinear function, which is actually locally linear because it's the blue line over there. And it has this linear region that maintains the unit activated if it's, in this case, greater than 0. We can add a bias, but we can add it in the response of the neuron. This is the same. And then, otherwise, if the response of the neuron is lower than 0, then we just put it to 0. Or if it's lower than a number. Okay? And then it has been shown that the convergence rate, if we use the rectified linear units instead as, for instance, the hyperbolic tangent, which is the green line. So it's a very similar function, but it's a smooth one. Okay. What we can see here in the other graph is that the the error decreases much faster at training phase. So with much less number of iterations, we achieve the same error if we use a rectified linear unit instead of an hyperbolic tangent. Okay? And this again, if going back to the design thing, so this would give us more time to try more networks, for instance. So the dropout. So the dropout is a technique that is used to avoid overfitting. So imagine that we have this artificial neural network. It's fully connected in this case. So usually the dropout is used in the fully connected layers. Okay. And during training, what you do is remove stochastically some hidden units with some probability. Okay. So usually this probability is set to 0.5, but it's only because it has been shown that in practice this probability works well, but you can use another probability, like 30%, like 0.3 or whatever. So this what prevents, or what you can think that prevents, is that the different units at the same layer don't co-adapt to each other, which means that they can be independently useful per se and do not depend that the other units are like co-adapted to them. Okay? So how can we do this? So here we have our neural network. And then during training, what we do is we apply the forward pass with our input. We compute it. And then what we do is we stochastically remove some of them once we have computed it. And then we go on. The only thing that we have to take into account is that during the back-propagation, we need to remember which ones we have removed, because this mask will also be applied. And since it's stochastic, if we take exactly the same input and we do the forward again, the units that will be removed will be different, because this is done with a certain probability. Okay? So what happens at testing is that we use all the units, because remember that at training they were only removed stochastically, so at the end eventually all of them were used and we have parameters for all of them. But what we do is we multiply each of these units for the probability that we were using to remove them. And this intuitively can be seen as an ensemble of neural networks. Why? Because during the training phase, some of the units were removed, right? And for each of the example or for each of the pass, the units that were removed were different. So the neural networks that were used for training were different from one another. But at testing, we have parameters for all the units. So it's like having this ensemble of classifiers. And actually, intuitively, it has been shown, if we have this idea of ensembles in mind, that an ensemble of classifiers works in practice much better than only having one classifier.
How often do you do the dropouts? Is that per sample or is it by batch or how does it?
Well, this depends on the design, but usually you do it by batch.
By batch?
Yeah.
How many samples
Per batch?
Yeah.
Depending on the training set, but you can have like 60 or 100 images per batch. Yeah. So do you have any questions about the dropout? Is more or less clear why this can help overfitting? Yes? And actually, this was also one of the key ingredients why these neural networks were able to train them fully supervised with all the parameters. So with all these ingredients, 2012, they won this challenge, like this ImageNet challenge. So here I just give you a picture of the results they achieved. So in that picture over there, you can see with the red bar the true label, and you can see that in most of the times is the one that has higher probability. So this is a testing. And then on this side of the slide, what you can see is that here you have the target image, and the other images are the ones from the training set that are more similar to the first one. And how do they compute this similarity? They take the feature vector at the last layer, so before the probabilities, so just at the feature vector, for each of the images, and then they compute the Euclidean distance. And the ones that are closer to the testing image is the ones that are shown here. So you can see that actually they are quite similar. So the representation is it's a quite good representation, and you can find the similarities as well in images and not only at the label class. So one question we can ask is, with this backpropagation learning, so how do the filters look? Okay, so the parameters, are they representative of the image, or how are they? So there are techniques to visualize the filters at the different layers. So you can imagine that at the first layer, you just take the filter because it's at the image level, so it's an RGB image. And what they saw is that the filters at the first layer, they are very similar to Gabor filters, or they are Gabor-like filters, which is kind of surprising because it's the same kind of templates that are found in the V1 of the macaque. Okay? And then here at the different layers, what you can see is the projection of the filters to the image. So it is not trivial to visualize these filters because they are very high dimensional, so you need an optimization algorithm to project them back to the image. And this is what you recover. But another way to visualize that can be maybe more intuitive. It's here. So they select the patches from the images that produce a high response to this particular neuron. Okay? So here you can see that the upper you go in the hierarchy, the patterns are more complex. And also the receptive field, so the size of the image that they see is much larger, which is what should happen because the receptive fields of the units at the higher layers of the hierarchy so the receptive field is much higher, or it's larger than at the first layer, which is only edges. Okay? So here, I don't know if you see very well, but at this layer, you already see people and things like can be objects already. Whereas here, you can at the second layer, you can only distinguish like different patterns that are not a particular object, but could be part of an object.
These were projected back into the image, or were they chosen, patch were selected from?
Exactly. So they were checking which patch of the image was responsible for the activation of a particular unit in the hierarchy. So for a particular template, let's say, or neuron.
But layer 4 and 5, it's not patches that you see, but it seems like it's...
Well, because since the higher you go to the hierarchy, the receptive field of each unit is much larger. So what makes activate this particular neuron is a much larger area of the image, so eventually can be the whole image, of course, than in the first layer that can be a patch of 5 by 5, for instance, depending on the filter size.
So the gray ones are the filters, and the right side is...
Yeah, so this one is the projected filters, let's say, because So here, the problem that I was mentioning before is that the filters that we learn in this 5th layer can have dimension of 200, for instance. So how do we visualize this, right? So we need to project in a 3D space, because otherwise we cannot visualize and we cannot imagine what it might be. So that's why this other technique of visualizing the part of the image that makes this particular neuron activate this neuron, it's also like a valid way to do it, and it's also much more intuitive for us to understand or to have an idea of what this neuron could represent. Okay, here is another way of visualizing. So you can go to the website and you can see yourself. So when you click to one of these units, you see the connection that makes the activation. Like for instance, if you click this one is mostly related to this one in the previous layer, and so on. And then what it shows here is some images and the parts of the images that were activated mainly by this unit. So that made activate this unit. So it's another way of visualizing, but essentially it's very similar to what I showed you before. Okay, so people have tried many things to understand what's going on in deep neural networks, because nobody really understands why they work so well and what happens in the hierarchy. So another attempt to understand what's encoded in the hierarchy is trying to see if there is any visual structure that is encoded in the hierarchy. So what they do is they optimize this problem in which they input a noise with an image with random noise. And what they want is that the score of this image, they want to modify the image such that the score predicts a particular label by the neural network. Like, for instance, in this case, imagine that you want class C. So you want to find an image that would predict class C by the neural network. Of course, this is an attempt. I say an attempt because we cannot find the global optima by this, so we cannot be sure that what we find is really what the network is representing. But you can see that in the images. I hope you can see well. Kind of. You don't see very well, but so for instance, here they optimize the algorithm such that in the image there is a husky predicted. So if you look carefully, it's a noisy image, but you can kind of see a dog there, like a shape of a dog. And the same with the cap and the dumbbell and all these examples. But again, we cannot be sure that it's really there in the model, because this algorithm doesn't converge to the global optima. But it's an interesting visualization. Okay, we talked a lot about invariance. So we can also check if the models that are learned with backpropagation with these deep neural networks are invariant to some transformation. So a way to do it, you can have a patch, for instance. In the second row, maybe here, you can see maybe there is a face of a dog. You can take this patch, and in the first row, you can shift it vertically. So the face of the dog would be in the upper part of the image, or it would go down until it's the contrary, or it goes up, okay? So here what you can measure is the Euclidean distance between the feature that you obtain when this particular object is centered with respect to the shifted versions of it. And then you can visualize the result. So how can you visualize the results? So you can see in this graph here, the one up, So each line corresponds to each of the example images, okay? So at 0, which is at the center, it's, so there at the center, it's when the object is exactly centered in the image, okay? And then when you go to the left or to the right, it represents the shift. So the number of pixels you have shifted this object. So what you can see is that here, if we take the features after the first layer, it's almost not invariant to translation, because the pooling that we are doing at the first layer, it's very small, like 5 by 5 pixels or even less, okay? So 0, of course, when you are at 0 and you compare to 0, the distance is 0, so it's perfectly the same. But then when you move a little bit, then the distance increases. In this case, exponentially, okay? But then when you go to the, I think this one is the 7th layer, what happens is that you become a bit more invariant. It's not perfect, because otherwise all the lines would be down to 0, but it's much more invariant than in the first graph. So what we can see here is that over the layers we have gained invariance to this vertical translation, okay? And then this can be translated to the prediction of the label. Okay, so this represents the same translation, and up is the probability of the ground truth label, so the correct one. So we can see that, for instance, in the blue one, the blue line, that I'm not sure which image represents, but one of those, it's quite stable across all different shifts, vertical shifts, because the probability that the true label is 1 is very high, almost always. Whereas the red line, it's not well predicted from the beginning, right? Even when it's centered, the prediction is not correct, because the probability that it's the true label is 0. So no matter where you place it, that you never recognize it. Okay, so you can do a similar experiment with other kinds of transformations. Like, for instance, let me remember. So this one is in scale, and this one is in rotation. And you can extract a similar conclusion. So here what, for instance, we can notice is that these networks are not rotation invariant. So you can see that the feature here, when it's perfectly at 0 degrees, or and the others, it's not the same. Otherwise, it would be 0 all the time if it would be rotation invariant. And these, okay, it's a bit more when you go up the layers, but not so much. And when you go here to the label, what you can see is that, for instance, here, that there are these values here. These values mean that for whatever reason, here it's more invariant than here. And you can see this also in the predicted label, okay? And this again relates with the sample complexity, because if the feature is very similar at this rotation and this rotation, then we don't need to show these examples to the at training time, because the prediction will be good at the end, no matter what, because the feature is the same. But if the representation is very different, like for instance here, we would need to show this kind of rotation or transformation to the training algorithm to be able to recognize it at testing time. Okay? So this is just an analysis of the invariance of such models for object recognition. Okay, so now that I have talked a bit about why they work, how we can train them, and the properties they have, like the invariance, so we can see a bit about applications. So mainly, so nowadays, people what is using the convolutional neural networks in this case, because for object recognition are the most popular ones, are use a pre-trained model like the ones I showed you before, like the AlexNet from 2012, or the BGG or the GoogleNet, that was the much deeper one. We'll use this model, which is already pre-trained using ImageNet, because we need this amount of data to be able to learn such a model, and then use it as a feature extractor. Okay, so we take our new data set, we compute the features of all our images with these pre-computed models, and then we use this to learn a classifier, for instance, with our new task. And this has been shown that work really well. So these features are really transferable to other kinds of applications. Okay. So another way of using those neural networks is, again, taking pre-trained models, as the ones I showed you before, for object recognition, and then fine-tune the parameters for the particular data set. What does this fine-tuning mean? So what it means is that you have already your model initialized, which is the model that you have learned on ImageNet in this case, for the particular case of object recognition on ImageNet. And then you do backpropagation and adapt the parameters of the model for your new data set with your new task. For instance, what can happen is that for ImageNet, our task is recognize 1,000 object categories, but in our new task could be recognizing only 10 categories. So we need to change also this loss function and adapt it to the new problem. Okay, and then of course, and this what one can do is just design a new network, and if you have big data and enough data to train it, just do everything from scratch, like David for these models for object recognition, like AlexNet, BGG, and GoogleNet, that they were designed and trained from scratch. So this you can also do, and you can do it for other tasks, not necessarily object recognition. Okay. So here I just included this slide as a reminder of the 3 different models that are most commonly used for object recognition, and that we can use for even for extracting features, or we can use also for fine-tuning. Okay, so I'm going to show you now an example of a pre-trained convolutional neural network as a feature example. And in particular, this particular example is for object detection. So object detection is also object categorization, but with the extra task that you have to locate the object on the image. So you need to deliver the object class, but you also need to deliver a bounding box around the object that you have detected. Okay? So it's a very similar task, but with an extra thing that you need to provide. Okay? So you can imagine that this task is much more challenging, because the number of possible bounding boxes in an image might be of millions, for instance, because the objects can be at any position at any scale. So you need to check all the possible bounding boxes in the image if there is an object there or not. Okay? So this was one of the first applications in which they took the models, the DNN models for object recognition, and applied there. So, and eventually what they did was what I told you: extract many possible bounding boxes from the image, and then extract the features. So this is the model, the CNN, extract the features at the last layer and then train a classifier, because in this particular data set, it was not the same as the original one, as ImageNet, but it was another one that had only 20 categories, okay, like person, cow, similar categories, but less categories, okay? Since it's very computationally expensive, because if for every image you need to extract all the bounding boxes, they just did a pre-processing in which they extracted 2,000 possible bounding boxes of candidate of objects. And there are algorithms for that. Okay, but this is just a pre-processing to speed up the process. Okay, and here I show you some results. So the bounding boxes are in red. The projector, yeah, it shows a little bit. So for instance, here you have the image and then the result of the algorithm. So these are real results. Is a bounding box here with high probability of, in this bounding box, that there is a person, and another bounding box here around the glasses for the class glasses. So it actually works really well. And with these, many other examples, like the dog here, and even the person, and you can see that the person is highly occluded because we don't see the face or we don't see the entire person, but it is still able to recognize that there is a person there. And other examples like the lemon, the rabbit, etc. So you can see that the output of the algorithm in this case is the bounding box plus the label class. Okay? And this one is one of the examples that the neural networks can be treated as a feature extractor and can generalize really well. So the data representation that you get from these pre-trained models is actually pretty good also for other tasks, not only for the tasks that they have been trained on. Okay, so another application that I wanted to talk about was when you have this model that is pre-trained, and then you fine-tune the parameters of the model to another data set. And in this case, probably the data set is much smaller than the original one, and that's why you don't train from scratch with this new data set, but you already use the pre-trained model as an initialization, because otherwise what would happen is that what the model we would learn won't generalize, probably. That's what would happen. Okay, so this is an example in which it's not object recognition, so you can see that these models can also be applied to other tasks that are not object recognition or object detection. So in this case, the task is to predict the saliency prediction. So what is the saliency prediction? So given an image, you give this, you present this image to humans, and these humans are wearing eye trackers, and then they free view the image, okay? And this for several seconds. And you repeat the same procedure with different humans, and then at the end you average the locations of where they have looked, and then you smooth it with a Gaussian. And you get responses like this. So this is the ground truth of the saliency map for this particular image. So you can see that mainly the people look at the face of the person and at the face of the dog, okay? And there are many applications in which people is interested in predicting automatically where people would look at the image, okay? And this is a model which can predict these saliency maps. So actually, how this model works is they take one of those pre-trained models. I think they report in the 3 of them. So the better it works in object recognition, the better it predicts the saliency model. And then they refine the parameters such that the prediction is close to the ground truth. So they do change the parameters with this new data set. Okay? And in this example, you can see that it's very difficult to acquire data because you need humans to label everything with an eye tracker, and you need many humans for each image because you need to average this. So this at the end is a kind of probability of where the humans will look. So starting from scratch would be very difficult that the model give some meaningful results at testing time. Okay? So I'm going to show you, since this is a very difficult, not difficult, but different problem from object recognition, I'm going to show you a small demo so you have a better feeling of how this task is working. Okay. So they have a demo online in which, do you see? Here. In which you can upload an image, and then with the model predicts where a human with a probability would look at the image. So this is not ground truth, this is the actual prediction. And they show in the paper that actually the results are very close to the ground truth. Okay? So here you can see that mainly it predicts that humans would look at the faces of the child, at the toys, and so on. And there are other examples. For instance, this one. You can also upload your own images, I think. Exactly. So here mainly, let me see. Now, what this model predicts is that the humans would look at the face of the dog. So why this model is useful for this particular task? So if we think about it, this model has been pre-trained for object category. And it has been shown that humans, when they look at images, they tend to look at objects. So it's very semantically dependent. And the features encode some semantic meaning, right? So it's kind of reasonable to think that what the features encode will be useful to predict saliency maps. And actually, this is one of the methods for saliency prediction, but now people is using more and more this kind of models for doing saliency prediction. Okay. And then finally, a last application that we can have is just design our own network, have our own data set, which potentially should have a lot of data, and train everything from scratch. So here we have an example. So this example is for semantic segmentation. So this is also very related to object recognition again, but in this particular problem, you not only need to deliver the label class, but you need to do it pixel by pixel. So I don't know if you see it very well, but at the beginning of the model, you would have an image, and then your output would be more like a regression task. Why? Because for each pixel, you need to deliver if it belongs to one class or another. So in this case, you can see here the shape of the dog, and then the color blue means that it's the label dog. Okay, so you can see that this model is quite different from the ones I presented before for object recognition, and that's why in this case we cannot use as is models that we already have or do fine-tuning. So why do they change it? They change it because since they need to do regression and then deliver an image, actually. So this is the same size as the original image. So first you have the layers of convolution and max pooling with rectifiers as we had for object recognition, but then we need the layers for the convoluting, because at the end what we have is just like a very small image or even a 1 by 1 with many templates. So what we need is to be able to go back to the original size, but for predicting what we want to have. In this case, it's an image with the label for each pixel. Okay.
So is the fully connected layer removed after it's trained?
So here they don't have a fully connected. So the only thing they have here is at the end. So here you see that it's convolutional. And they don't have the fully connected because at the fully connected, they use it to deliver one label per class. So the probability of this image belonging to one class or another, or that there is an object for a particular class. But in this case, so we don't want to lose the spatial resolution, because what we want for each pixel, the class that it belongs to. So if we would have the fully connected, probably what would happen is that we would lose all this spatial resolution, and maybe we could not recover the particular position for each label to each pixel.
So was the train from was the final layer at the segmentation?
Yeah. So this is so the objective function in so the loss is the difference, let's say like the regression between the ground truth and what the network predicts. And what you want is that what the network predicts, which is a full image in which each pixel has a label value, is the same as the original one, or at least as close as possible. So you can see that this is a very challenging task because the images are quite large, and what you want is that each pixel, you assign a label to each pixel, so it's quite a challenging task. Okay, and here are some examples. So these are some images, like a dog or different cows or a person. And this is the ground truth. So this is what you want to predict here. This is labeled usually by a human, and it's part of your data set. So you can use this for your training. It's actually this pair that you have for training for each image. Okay, so you can see here that the output is a kind of a structured output. It's not one number anymore as we had with object recognition. With object recognition, what we wanted to predict was only a single label per image. Whereas here, we predict a label per pixel. Okay? And then here you can see some results that are obtained with the deep neural network that I showed you before. Okay. Actually, these are the final results, but these are obtained by stacking the results at different layers of the convolution. So you can imagine that here, if you have a particular image, but you can resize it and you can have a prediction. So this would be one prediction at the coarse level. Then you could have another prediction at the finer level. And then finally, the prediction at the actual size. And you can combine all these, like an ensemble or like an higher, to have much better performance at the end. And actually, that's what they do. Okay. One of the drawbacks of this model is that it doesn't take into account the whole structure, like for instance, that one pixel next to another pixel has a high probability to have the same class. So this, we don't use it as a prior here. So another thing that they tried actually is just to place a probability model, so a conditional random field, to impose these constraints. And okay, and then at the end, what happens is that the results that you get are much more smoother. On top of that, so you can use the probability that you get for each pixel, and then just plug this into a probabilistic model to take into account this structured output as a prior, okay? Because here we don't have, so with the DNN as it is, we are not encoding this kind of information. So it's what the network learns from scratch. Okay, and here are some of the results that I showed you before. Actually, you have to think that these are very impressive results because you can see the boundaries and they follow well the animal. So one of the challenges of this is that the boundaries should follow exactly the same as the ground truth, but in the current evaluation metrics, this is not taken into account. So it's not penalized if you don't do it. But visually, it looks really good. Okay. So another application that you can use DNNs for is for estimating the depth map of an image. So here the task is given an image. So here is the input image. And here is the label. So here each color represents a particular depth. Okay. So you need to predict the depth given a single image. This again is very challenging because to predict depth you need 2 images or you need a video like structured from motion. But here the depth is predicted from a single image. Okay, so intuitively, this is also very related to objects because if you have a notion of object or that and things like that, so you can use this as okay. Usually, this kind of object has this shape, and the shape gives a particular depth, right? So intuitively, you can see why this could work, but again, like predicting the depth for an input image only having the target image at the training time, it's quite an achievement, right? Here it's only showing the normals, so the vector perpendicular to the surface for each pixel. So you can see here that this is a flat surface, this is a flat surface, the wall is a flat surface, and so on. Okay. And of course, the applications are not only for vision, so you could think of many other applications. Like for instance, in this case, it's for speech synthesis. So they have a natural speech signal, which is the black line, and then they want to be able to synthesize this kind of signals, right? So this can also be done with DNN. They also need like probably more sophisticated like HMM or other techniques on top of this, but DNNs are very good at predicting this kind. I think in this case the DNN, which is the red line, the speech synthesis was done without a hidden Markov model, and the blue line is with a hidden Markov model, and you can see that the results are very similar. So what you can achieve with a DNN is very close to what you would achieve with something that would have temporal consistency. And staying in speech, you can also, for instance, do phoneme recognition. So there are certain tasks in speech in which they give you a training set with phonemes like GAPA, things like this, and the particular label which phoneme corresponds to, and you need to predict at testing time given a new sample which phoneme it belongs to. Okay, so recently they have achieved quite impressive results with a deep neural network that goes from the spectrogram until and then the prediction goes only with the DNN, because usually again people not only was using DNNs but also was using like hidden Markov models to take into account the temporal consistency. So they are trying to get rid of these probabilistic models and only use DNNs. Yes.
The invariances, one is trying to deal with our translation, basically, and also scale, or
In which case?
in the scale of speech.
Well, in the case of speech, it's not the same as the image, right? Because in speech you would have, for instance, invariance to pitch, like in frequency. In time, not so much, but maybe a little bit.
The translations in the spectrum.
Exactly, exactly. So this would be more like in the spectrum scenario. So in the image is much more intuitive because we see and we understand it, right? So that's why I focus the main of almost all the talk in object recognition, because it's much more intuitive to understand. But of course, this can be applied to many other problems.
Fourier transform a link or signal is amplitude or?
Okay, so in the example that I showed you, it was, I think, from the Fourier transform. So I'm not that familiar with this particular, so I'm not a speech person, but they do have, like they use some transformation at the beginning, like the Fourier transform, or like hard-coded filters. Like, so the Fourier transform is like having a basis of filters, right?
Yeah.
So why is it called end-to-end?
Because it's with a very minimal transformation up to the end, because before people, or still, they are using HMM, other techniques on top, and many more processing at the beginning.
No, but I mean, Fourier is another feature, right? I mean, the
Yeah,
basis,
sure.
the basis
Sure.
what you-
So actually, they are trying to get rid of everything and only use DNNs, but I think there are some results that show that it's very promising and that they are achieving good performance, but there are still many methods using other transformations. Yeah. If you are interested with this, Yorgos will be the main person. He's the
Comment on that is
Yeah.
end-to-end here also refers to the language part. So in speech recognition, you have a language part also. You have a model for language, which is statistical.
Oh, natural language on
Yeah,
top
so you
of
have both the acoustic model and you have the language model. So the end-to-end in this case refers to replacing both of these statistical models with just one pass of the data. You just have acoustic observations, which are basically Fourier transforms, and you want to do the entire modeling, this two-pass modeling, both the acoustic and the language model.
with an RNN.
Not necessarily.
Exactly.
In this case, it's CNN, but yeah, RNNs.
Okay, so if interested in trying all these or applying your own problem and use DNN, so there are several frameworks that one can use, and they are available and they are free online. So one of that is very used is Café. Café and it has interfaces for MATLAB and Python, and it's very widely used, and there are a lot of tutorials and a lot of blogs where people comment their problems or what they are trying. It's very well optimized, and actually it's quite simple to use. It's difficult to change from the inside. So it's in C++, and you can add more functionalities, but it's not so easy. So now people is also using a lot Torch. Torch, I think, is from Facebook, and what it gives much more flexibility, because instead of using like configuration files and so on to define your networks, you use code. So you are very flexible in doing whatever you want in each layer because you have to call the function like convolution and pooling and so on, right? So for instance, storage is very useful if you want to add recurrency, which is not so straightforward in Caffe. Okay. Another library that is available is Theano. For those who program in Python, so Theano is a library that is from Python, and it has all the functionalities that are used for convolutional neural networks and deep neural networks, so convolution pooling and the derivative as well for the back-propagation and so on. So this is another possibility, which of course is probably one of the more flexible ones because you have to do everything. It's just that you have the functions, right, that you can use. So you don't have to program from scratch, but still you have the library. And another possibility is to use this matcomnet, which is the library for MATLAB. So probably is the simplest to use because it's MATLAB. Everyone is familiar with MATLAB. But on the downside, since it's MATLAB, it's not so efficient as the other ones. But again, you can extend it as well, and if you know MATLAB, it's easy to use. So I leave the links here, and then we will upload the slides just in case you are interested in trying. And all these models that I was talking about of object recognition, most of them are pre-computed and available online. So you can download them and start applying them in your particular task. So finally, very briefly, this minute that is left. So I just want to leave that Tommy will follow up in the probably next class. So one of the intriguing properties of the convolutional neural networks that has been found is that given an image, you can produce a noise. So this is an image. You can produce a noise and add it to the image. And then initially, this image was correctly classified with high confidence by the CNN. But then when you add this noise, which is imperceptible to humans, so for us it makes no sense to add the noise or not, then the CNNs miserably fail, which means that they are not able to generalize when this noise is added to the image. Okay? This can be a little bit worrying because imagine that you want to use this for security. Then hackers would have a free gate there to do whatever they want, right? So there are many studies now that are trying to understand why this is happening, and this is an open line of research, which also give insights of how they work, because it's a failure, this. Another intriguing property is that you can generate a synthetic image that contains no objects, so it's completely synthetic, and then you forward this to the CNN, and it gives a very high confidence that it belongs to a certain object class. And the image is completely synthetic. Like, for instance, if you think twice, maybe you can know why. Like, for instance, here, this synthetic image, it says sunglasses. Okay, the shape is similar, but still, with very high confidence, and this is not a natural image, right? And another example, let me see. Like this one is an acoustic guitar. Okay, maybe the color or the shape. So these are two properties that people is now not struggling, but trying to understand why this is happening with the CNNs. Can you say that again?
If you add some noise to this particular image, would the prediction change?
Well, depending on the noise, which kind of noise? Like the one before?
To, like, say, to the acoustic guitar image, you just add some random noise.
So if you add random noise, probably it won't change the prediction. And if you shift a bit, probably it won't also change because the CNN detects this really as an acoustic guitar, so it's completely sure. But you can add noise as the one before, so you can always find a noise that is even imperceptible that will make the CNN predict this particular label, but another.
I see. So this is a robust wrong prediction.
Yes, it is.
The worst real like noise that you can add like imperceptible. But
Yeah, exactly. And to finalize, just some more open questions like do they work as memory? So it's just that they have a lot of templates and they are memorizing the training set. And another question that we might ask, like, why do we need hierarchies? And in fact, in practice, they work better. So why hierarchies work better than only one layer? And I think Tommy will explain you a little bit more about this last question in particular. And with this, I finalize the class. Thank you.